"That Swedish woman is digging her children's grave," Silas Drummond announced to everyone at Whitley's General Store on October 3rd, 1883. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear, loud enough for the words to carry out the door and down the street and into the collective memory of Granite Falls, Montana. 14 weeks later, Silas Drummond would crawl through a blizzard on his hands and knees, drag his frost-bitten body down a hidden tunnel, and beg that same Swedish woman to save his family's lives. But that morning in October, nobody in Madison County knew what was coming. Nobody except perhaps the woman herself, who stood on the porch of her cabin with her hands still damp from the morning's goat milk, watching a rider on a black horse approach from the east road. She knew the horse before she knew the man. That black gelding with the cropped tail belonged to Judge Cornelius Whitaker, and Judge Whitaker did not make social calls. He was 61 years old, built like a fence post that had survived too many winters. He carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who believed the valley owed him something. He was the largest landholder in the territory, held a seat on the territorial council, and possessed a voice that moved through town meetings like cold water through a cracked foundation. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He simply arrived, and things changed. Britta Lindqvist watched him walk past her small paddock, where her 2 horses stood in the early light. The buckskin mare named Saga lifted her head. The gray gelding called Storm shifted his weight. In the adjacent pen, 4 sheep huddled together, their wool thick with the approach of autumn. They were calm animals, trusting animals, and Britta felt a sharp pull in her chest because she already understood that this visit was about them. At her feet, an old border collie named Odin pressed his graying muzzle against her ankle. He was 9 years old, had belonged to her husband before he belonged to her, and he had not left her side in 2 years. Not since the morning she found Arvid's body in the snow. Whitaker stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He adjusted his hat once, a gesture she had seen him make before difficult pronouncements, and he looked not at her, but at the paddock behind him, as if he were appraising livestock at auction. 2 small faces appeared in the cabin window behind Britta. Solveig, 7 years old, with her father's pale eyes. Gunnar, 5 years old, who no longer remembered what his father looked like. Then Whitaker spoke. The Territorial Council had passed a new ordinance regarding livestock safety. The wolves had taken 6 sheep from the northern range in a single week, and the authorities had determined that any animal not secured in a registered fortified structure by the first hard freeze would be seized and reassigned to the regional stockyard. The ordinance required a standard timber barn with a double-walled perimeter, inspected and approved before the deadline. Britta had 15 days. She did the math before he finished talking. A barn of that specification required 2,500 board feet of seasoned pine, 500 pounds of iron hardware, and a team of 8 men working 12-hour shifts. She had no access to the mill. She had no funds to hire a crew. She had a shovel, a pickaxe, 2 horses, and 4 sheep that were the only reason she could plow her field, haul her water, and survive another winter on this land. Without them, the homestead was not a home. It was a coffin with a view. Whitaker knew this. The flatness of his voice told her he knew this. The way his eyes moved across her property told her he had already calculated the outcome. This was not a warning. It was a countdown. He paused before mounting his horse, and that was when he said the thing that made her fingers curl into fists at her sides. He mentioned that he had once offered to buy her land at a fair price, and she had declined. He said it casually, the way a man mentions the weather before delivering bad news. "This time there is no price, Mrs. Lindqvist. only the deadline. He looked at the flat, rocky ground surrounding her cabin and remarked that she should start packing her trunk before the frost set in. He saw no timber stacks. He saw no construction site. He saw a 34-year-old widow standing on a piece of land that would soon be his, because the stockyard needed livestock and the territorial council needed order, and Britta Lindqvist was neither strong enough nor connected enough to provide either. But then his eyes moved to something else. Something behind the cabin that made him pause for just a moment longer than necessary. The creek. The spring-fed creek that ran through her property in a shallow depression near the tree line before continuing south. It pooled in a natural basin behind her cabin, and even in the coldest months, it never froze solid. Britta saw where he was looking. She understood. He mounted the black gelding and rode east without looking back. Britta stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded into the dry October air. She did not call after him. She did not curse his name. Odin pressed against her leg, and she placed one hand on his graying head. The point was not to convince Cornelius Whitaker of anything. The point was to ensure that by the time the snow fell, there would be nothing for the law or the wolves to find. She did not go inside immediately. She sat on the top step of the porch and looked at the paddock. Saga was nosing at the fence rail. Storm had returned to his hay. The sheep were bunched together in a patch of morning sun, their wool catching the light in a way that made them look almost golden. 2 horses, 4 sheep. Arvid's animals. Arvid Lindqvist had been dead for 2 years, and Britta still measured time by the things he had left behind. The cabin. The fence posts he had sunk crooked because he never checked the level twice. The livestock he had bought in the spring of 1881 because he believed that spring would last forever. That was the kind of man Arvid was, optimistic in a way that bordered on reckless. He saw the world as a series of opportunities that would sort themselves out if you just kept moving forward. He had built the cabin on a slight rise of compacted clay and limestone, thinking only of drainage. Good drainage meant dry floors. Dry floors meant comfort, and comfort meant Britta would stop asking when he planned to reinforce the north wall. He never reinforced the north wall. He bought a yearling sheep instead, because the idea of expanding the flock excited him more than the idea of a windbreak in the winter. He died on a frozen road in December of 1881, riding too fast toward town to buy Christmas gifts for the children. The horse slipped. Arvid fell. His neck broke on impact. It was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It was the consequence of a man who never calculated the risk of ice on a downhill grade. Britta loved him for his warmth and hated him for his carelessness. 2 years later, she had not fully reconciled those two feelings. She whispered it aloud, sitting on the porch step with the deadline ticking behind her eyes. "You left me 2 horses and 4 sheep and not a single board to shelter them, Arvid." Her voice was not angry, just tired. The tiredness of a woman who had been solving another person's unfinished equations for 700 days. She remembered the last morning she had seen him alive. He had been standing in the same doorway, pulling on his gloves, telling her about the set of carved wooden combs he had seen in the general store on his previous trip to town. He wanted to buy them for her for Christmas. She had told him the road was too icy, that the grade on the South Hill was a sheet of glass in December, that a man could wait 3 days for a thaw and the combs would still be there. Arvid had smiled the way he always smiled when she tried to calculate the risk out of his plans. He said he would take the lower road. He did not take the lower road. He took the fast road, the steep road, the road that saved 20 minutes and cost everything. That was Arvid. He always believed the shortcut would hold, that the ice would not be as bad as she said, that the next bend would be the easy one. He was wrong on a Tuesday morning in December, and Britta had been right every day since. Being right had not once made her warm at night. From inside the cabin, Solveig's voice called out, "Mama, who was that man?" Britta stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and turned toward the door. Through the window, she could see both children watching her with the particular alertness of young things who sense danger they cannot name. "Nobody important," Britta said. "Just a man who thinks he knows what the winter will bring." But the tiredness did not last. It never did with Britta. Grief was a luxury she had learned to ration, and she had work to do. After the children had eaten their breakfast porridge and gone to play near the woodpile under Odin's watchful eye, she walked to the edge of the cabin where the ground sloped slightly downward toward the creek. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the earth. It was cool, dense, the color of old rust. She picked up a handful and squeezed it, watching how it held its shape, how the moisture content made it packed tight without crumbling. And that was when her father's voice came back to her. Not as a ghost, not as a sentimental memory. It came back as engineering. Magnus Lindqvist had been a Swedish copper miner who crossed the Atlantic in 1852 with a wife, a daughter, and a set of skills that most Americans did not know existed. He was a man of the earth in the most literal sense. He understood that the strongest structures were not those built against the sky, but those integrated into the foundation of the world. He had spent 30 years underground, reading the language of stone and clay and pressure the way other men read newspapers. When Britta was 12 years old, he had taken her into the mine where he worked, not to show her the copper, to show her the silence. They had stood together in a chamber 60 feet below the surface, surrounded by walls of compacted clay and limestone, and Magnus had put his hand on the stone and said something she never forgot. "Listen, Britta. The silence down here is different from the silence above. Up there, silence is empty. Down here, silence means everything is holding together." He taught her to read the veins in clay, to know which layers bore weight and which held water. He explained that a mountain does not fall because it understands the distribution of force, and that the most efficient way to stay warm was to let the planet itself provide the insulation. This was not luck or folklore. It was the thermal mass of the soil. The Earth, at a depth of 8 feet, maintains a constant temperature of roughly 55 degrees, regardless of what the air above is doing. A man who understands that principle can survive a blizzard. A man who ignores it will freeze inside a wooden box. Magnus had died when Britta was 14. A mine collapse in Pennsylvania, 1863. But the detail that shaped the rest of her life was this. The tunnel Magnus had designed never collapsed. Not one stone shifted, not one beam cracked. He died in a section built by another crew, men who had cut corners to save time and money, men who braced their ceilings with green timber instead of cured stone because it was cheaper and faster and nobody was going to check. Magnus had trusted them. He walked into their section on a Wednesday morning in March, and by Wednesday afternoon he was buried under 8 tons of rock that should never have been above his head. The lesson was simple, and it was absolute. Proper engineering does not betray the person who trusts it. Only carelessness kills. Britta carried that lesson the way other women carried lockets. It was invisible, and it was always with her. Now she crouched beside her cabin, holding a fistful of clay that her father would have recognized instantly, and she began to think in volumes instead of surfaces. Arvid had looked at this land and seen a place to stand. Britta looked at it and saw a place to hide. The cabin's footprint was 24 feet by 18 feet, resting on a perimeter of dry stacked stone. Below that lay a layer of dense, frost-resistant clay that descended 8 feet before hitting bedrock. The clay was the right consistency. The limestone deposits in the area were abundant and accessible. The bedrock was solid, which meant anything built on top of it would not shift or settle. She spent that first evening doing calculations by candlelight while the children slept. To house 2 horses and 4 sheep comfortably, she needed a space 14 feet wide, 22 feet long, with a ceiling height of at least 8 feet. That meant relocating nearly 2,000 cubic feet of soil. It was an enormous amount of earth to move by hand. It was also the exact kind of work that a miner's daughter had been trained to do. The decision she made the next morning was the first turning point, and it was the one that would determine everything that followed. She did not walk to the yard and begin digging a hole where every neighbor, every passerby, and every one of Whitaker's informants could see. Instead, she went inside her cabin, moved the table and chairs, and pried up the heavy floorboards in the center of her living space. The first bucket of dirt dropped into the darkness below, and the opening was created. She was not building a barn. She was building a secret. What Britta was about to attempt had never been done in Montana territory. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you do not. Stay with me. Her strategy was precise. She dug from 3 in the morning until noon, working beneath the floor of her own home where no one could see or hear. The children slept through the earliest hours, and when they woke, she told them she was fixing the foundation, which had settled after the spring rains. Solveig accepted this without question. Gunnar was too young to understand what a foundation was. In the afternoons, when the fog rolled in from the creek and visibility dropped to 30 yards, she loaded the excavated dirt into a modified wheelbarrow and hauled it to the creek behind the property. She spread it thin along the bank where the water would carry it downstream. She never dumped it in piles. She never left traces. In the evenings, after the children were asleep and Odin was curled at the foot of their bed, she climbed back down and braced the newly exposed walls with stone, fitting each piece by hand using a technique her father had called the friction lock. The flat face of each stone turned inward. The rough face turned outward. The stones arranged in a radiating pattern where the geometry itself provided the strength. Her neighbors saw what she wanted them to see. A woman who was not hauling timber from the mill. A woman who had no stacks of lumber, no sound of hammering, no rising skeleton of a barn. They saw only a widow who appeared to be cleaning her house and moving small piles of dirt to the creek. The community assumed she had given up. They assumed she was tidying her affairs before the deadline arrived, and Whitaker came to collect what the law now said was his. They did not realize that the dirt she carried away was the volume of a hidden sanctuary taking shape beneath her feet. The physical toll of the work was absolute. By the 8th day, Britta's palms were a map of burst blisters and new calluses, yellow and hard, layered over each other like the rings of a felled tree. She ate her meals standing because sitting down meant she might not stand up again. She slept in 2-hour intervals because sleeping longer meant losing the pre-dawn darkness, and darkness was the only safe window for hauling dirt to the creek. Her body was becoming a ledger of the work. Each muscle recorded the debt in a currency of soreness and strain that compounded daily. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. Her dresses hung looser. Her face sharpened at the cheekbones and the jaw. When she caught her reflection in the water barrel, she saw a woman she barely recognized. Someone older and thinner and harder than the person who had stood on this porch 15 days ago and watched a man on a black horse ride away. But the vault was growing. Every bucket of earth she removed was a bucket of space she gained. And the space was becoming something real, something with walls and dimensions, and the beginnings of a ceiling that would hold the weight of her entire world above it. On the morning of the 5th day, Silas Drummond came to visit. He was 54 years old, the largest cattle rancher in Madison County, and he had lived in this valley for 28 years. He walked with the confident stride of a man who believed his experience was the only kind of knowledge worth having. He had buried 2 wives, raised 5 children, and lost more livestock to winter than most men would own in a lifetime. He knew this land. He knew what it demanded. And he knew with absolute certainty that the Swedish widow on the creekside property was finished. He found Britta splitting kindling near the woodpile, Odin lying watchfully at her feet. He noticed immediately that she was thinner than she had been a month ago. He noticed the calluses on her palms, yellow and hard, the kind that come from gripping a shovel handle for 14 hours a day. He noticed the faint smell of clay on her clothes, a smell that did not belong on a woman with wooden floors. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, tipping his hat, "I came to see how you were getting on with your preparations." Britta did not stop splitting kindling. "Getting on fine, Mr. Drummond. I don't see any timber. I don't see any construction." "No. The deadline is in 10 days. I am aware." Silas studied her for a long moment. He was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a practical one, and practical men often mistake their own limitations for universal laws. He had never built anything underground. He had never considered that the earth itself could be a shelter. The idea would not have occurred to him any more than the idea of breathing underwater. "You have no crew," he said. "No money. No materials. What exactly are you building?" Britta finally looked up at him. Her eyes were steady, and there was something in them that Silas could not read. Not defeat, not desperation, something else entirely. "A place where my children will be warm," she said. Silas waited for more. When nothing came, he shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Lindqvist, I have lived in this valley for 28 years. I have seen what winter does to people who are not prepared. I have buried neighbors who thought they knew better than the cold. Whatever you are doing out here, whatever hole you are digging in the ground, it will not save your livestock. And when they are gone, your children will follow. Not because you are weak, because you are alone, and alone is not enough in this country." Britta returned to her kindling. The axe fell. The wood split. "You will see, Mr. Drummond." She said it quietly, without defiance, without argument. Just a statement of fact that had not yet been proven. Silas Drummond rode back to town that afternoon and walked into Whitley's general store. Prudence Whitley was behind the counter, arranging bolts of fabric, and 3 other men were gathered near the stove, discussing the price of feed grain. Silas did not lower his voice. "That Swedish woman is digging her children's grave." The word spread through Granite Falls within the hour. By nightfall, everyone in the valley had heard some version of what Silas Drummond had said about the widow Lindqvist. By the following morning, the story had grown. She was digging a hole. She was burying something. She had lost her mind to grief. She was practicing some kind of pagan Swedish ritual. She was going to kill her own children and bury them in the earth. The truth was simpler and stranger than any of the rumors. But no one in Granite Falls had the imagination to guess it. On the 7th day, the first of Britta's allies appeared. She was hauling dirt to the creek in the late afternoon fog, moving quickly, checking the road every few seconds for witnesses. Odin walked beside her, his ears rotating, his old nose working the air. Then a voice came from behind her. "You are setting those stones with a friction lock." Britta spun, her hand going instinctively to the shovel in the wheelbarrow. Odin growled low in his throat, but did not bark. Ezekiel Thorne sat on a boulder 10 feet away. He was 71 years old and looked 80. He had been a bridge builder before the drink took his steadiness, and now he lived in a shack on the edge of town, doing odd jobs for men who needed a back and did not care whose it was. His clothes were worn to the color of dust. His hands trembled when he was not holding something, but his eyes were sharp, and they were fixed on the stones Britta had been carrying. "The flat face is inward," Zeke continued. "The rough face is out. Magnus taught you that." Britta felt the blood leave her face. In 7 days of secret work, she had been careful. She had timed her trips. She had watched the road. She had cleaned every trace of clay from her floors before dark. And now a man she barely knew was sitting by her creek, reading her construction technique like a signature. Zeke saw her fear. He took a slow drink from a bottle that had been resting against his thigh, and then he set it down beside him. "I owe Whitaker $40 for whiskey," he said. "If he finds out I helped you, he will call the debt and I will lose my shack. But I owe your father more than $40. He paused, and something shifted in his weathered face. "Magnus carried me out of a collapsing tunnel in 1858. Put me on his back and walked 300 yards in the dark with rock falling around us. He never once put me down. I would have died in that hole if not for him. Your father saved my life, Mrs. Lindqvist, and I have been drinking ever since because I could not find a way to repay him." Britta did not move. She was calculating. She had not anticipated this. She had planned for hostility, for indifference, for the slow, grinding pressure of a community that wanted her to fail. She had not planned for an ally who was also a liability. "I was there when Magnus died," Zeke continued. "In the Pennsylvania mine, the section built by the other crew, the one with the green timber and the corners that had been cut. He died because he trusted someone who built wrong." Zeke looked at the stones in Britta's wheelbarrow. "You will not die because you are building right." It was the first time since Arvid's death that someone had looked at Britta and seen not a widow, but an engineer. Zeke did not promise to help long term. He was too fragile for that, and they both knew it. He promised one specific thing. He would come for one night only, to help her set the limestone arches for the ceiling of the vault. It was the one part of the construction that required 2 people. The part where the keystone had to be held in place while the supporting stones were locked into position. In exchange, Britta would never tell anyone he had been there. She agreed. They did not shake hands. The agreement was sealed by something older than a handshake. It was sealed by the memory of a man who had carried a drunk bridge builder out of a collapsing tunnel 25 years ago, and by the understanding that some debts do not expire. The skeptics continued to arrive. On the 9th day, Aldous Pemberton came to the cabin. He was 47 years old, a graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he had been retained by Judge Whitaker to provide a professional assessment of the widow's situation. He wore a suit that was too fine for the mud of a homestead, and he carried a leather case containing instruments for measuring soil density and structural load capacity. He asked Britta's permission to examine the ground around her cabin. She granted it, knowing that he would find nothing above the surface that would reveal what lay below. Pemberton spent 2 hours taking samples and making calculations. He tested the clay composition. He measured the frost line. He evaluated the drainage patterns and the angle of the slope. When he was finished, He stood on Britta's porch and delivered his verdict with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong about anything measurable. The soil here cannot support arch loads over 6 feet without significant reinforcement. The clay content is too high, the water table too variable. Any subterranean construction of the type you might be attempting would collapse within the first freeze-thaw cycle. It is structurally impossible. Britta listened. She did not argue. Structurally impossible, she repeated. I am afraid so, Mrs. Lindqvist. Whatever you believe your father taught you, the physics of this particular location do not support it. Pemberton returned to town and filed his report with Judge Whitaker. The report concluded that the Lindqvist property showed no evidence of viable construction and that the deadline would not be met. The livestock would be seized. The land would be foreclosed. The matter was settled. What Pemberton did not know, and could not have measured with his instruments, was that Britta had already excavated 1,200 cubic feet of that impossible clay. The walls of her vault were smooth and hardening in the cool underground air. The foundation stones were set in patterns that his textbooks did not describe, and the arch structure that he claimed could not exist was waiting only for Zeke's hands to help complete it. Pemberton had measured the earth from the surface. Britta had listened to it from within. On the 10th day, Reverend Nathaniel Holbrook arrived to save Britta's soul. He was 58 years old, with silver hair and the particular certainty of a man who believed that faith could overcome any obstacle, including the laws of thermodynamics. He had heard the rumors about the Swedish widow and her strange digging, and he was concerned that pagan practices might be taking root in his community. Mrs. Lindqvist, he said, standing in her doorway with his Bible pressed against his chest. I have come to offer you guidance in this difficult time. Britta was exhausted. She had slept 3 hours in the last 2 days. Her hands were bleeding beneath the bandages she had wrapped around her palms. She was in no mood for guidance. I appreciate your concern, Reverend. These methods you are pursuing, Holbrook continued. This digging in the earth like some kind of creature. It is not Christian work. It is not the way we build in this country. Perhaps if you spent more time in prayer and less time in the dirt, the Lord would provide a solution. Britta looked at him for a long moment. My father prayed every Sunday, Reverend. He also built tunnels that never collapsed. I intend to do both. Holbrook's face reddened. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially by women, and especially by foreign women who smelled of clay and exhaustion. Perhaps prayer would serve you better than pagan engineering, he said, and left without waiting for a response. 2 days later, he would stand in his own church and announce to his congregation that the Lindqvist woman had rejected the guidance of the Lord and chosen instead to pursue the dark arts of her ancestors. He did not specify what those dark arts were, but he implied that they involved dirt and stubbornness and an unwillingness to accept the superiority of American construction methods. The congregation nodded. They had suspected as much. Meanwhile, Prudence Whitley was doing her part to ensure that everyone in Granite Falls knew exactly how pitiful the widow's situation had become. Prudence was 52 years old, married to the owner of the general store, and possessed of a voice that could carry gossip across 3 counties without losing any of its venom. She had never liked Britta Lindqvist. The Swedish woman was too quiet, too self-sufficient, too unwilling to participate in the social rituals that Prudence considered essential to civilized life. Poor thing, Prudence said to anyone who would listen. Grief has taken her mind, digging holes in the middle of the night like some kind of animal. Those poor children. Someone should really do something. No one did anything. Doing something would have required effort. and effort was in short supply when winter was approaching, and there was no benefit to helping a widow who was clearly determined to destroy herself. On the 11th day, Jasper Kettridge came to make a bet. Jasper was 22 years old, the son of the town blacksmith, and he possessed the particular combination of confidence and ignorance that often afflicts young men who have never been wrong about anything important. He rode up to Britta's cabin with two friends, all three of them grinning with the anticipation of easy entertainment. "Hey, Swedish lady," Jasper called from his horse. "I heard you're building something special out here, some kind of underground palace for your sheep." Britta was hauling water from the creek. She did not look up. "I bet Billy here $5 that whatever you're building collapses before Christmas. Want to take the other side of that bet?" Britta continued walking toward the cabin, the water buckets balanced on her shoulders. "Tell you what," Jasper continued, raising his voice. "I'll even pre-dig the graves for your animals. Save you some time when the whole thing falls in on itself." His friends laughed. Jasper grinned wider. Britta stopped at the porch. She set down the water buckets. She turned and looked at Jasper Kettridge with the same steady expression she had shown Silas Drummond. "Winter will answer your questions better than I can," she said. Then she went inside and closed the door. Jasper and his friends rode away, still laughing, convinced that they had witnessed the beginning of the end of the Swedish widow's foolish enterprise. They had no idea that beneath the floor of that cabin, a vaulted chamber was taking shape that would outlast every structure they would ever build. They had no idea that in 14 weeks, Jasper Kettridge would be standing in that chamber with 3 frost-bitten fingers wrapped in bandages, asking Britta Lindqvist to teach him how to build what she had built. But that was in the future. On the 11th day, there was only the work. That evening, Leland Stroud appeared at the cabin. Leland was 38 years old, a farmer with ambitions that exceeded his intelligence, and he had attached himself to Judge Whitaker the way a barnacle attaches to a hull. He wanted cheap land leases, and the easiest way to get them was to be useful to the man who controlled the leases. That meant keeping watch. That meant reporting. He walked the perimeter of Britta's cabin slowly, his eyes scanning the empty paddock, the tree line, the ground. The horses and sheep were not visible because Britta had started keeping them in a thicket of brush a quarter-mile east during the day, moving them back to the hidden entrance of the tunnel at night. Leland asked where they were. Britta told him they were grazing in the eastern valley. Leland looked at her the way a dog looks at a closed gate. Then he stepped to the cabin window and peered inside. The floorboards had been carefully replaced. The furniture returned to its normal position, but in one corner, near the base of the wall, there was a smear of fresh clay. Dark, reddish-brown against the weathered gray of the pine boards. It was small. It was also unmistakable. "Why is there mud on your floor?" Leland asked. "Spilled the wash water," Britta said. Leland held her gaze for a long moment. He was not smart enough to deduce what she was doing, but he was suspicious enough to know that something did not add up. The color of that clay was wrong. It was the color of earth that came from depth, not from the surface. It was the color of secrets. Before he left, he delivered Whitaker's message with the practiced flatness of a man repeating words he had memorized. "Judge Whitaker will inspect on the 15th. No shelter, he brings men to take the livestock. If you have hidden them, that is a territorial violation." After Leland's horse disappeared around the bend, Britta went inside and looked at the clay smear on the floor. Such a small thing. A thumbprint of evidence that could unravel everything. She got a bucket of water and scrubbed the spot until the wood was clean. And from that night forward, she added a new step to her routine. Every evening, before she allowed herself to sleep, she got on her hands and knees and inspected every inch of the cabin floor. Every board, every joint, every crack where a particle of clay might have lodged itself. The race was no longer just against the deadline. It was against the suspicion that was spreading through the valley like frost through a window crack. Britta had been surviving skeptics and dodging suspicion for 11 days. But on the 12th day, the earth itself tried to kill her. She was cutting the spiral ramp that would allow the horses and sheep to enter the vault from outside the cabin. The tunnel ran from a hidden thicket of brush 35 yards behind the property, descending at a gradual angle until it met the main chamber. The floor was lined with 6 inches of packed sand and pine needles to deaden the sound of hooves. She was cutting the final section, the junction point where the ramp met the main chamber, when the earth gave way beneath her. It was not a collapse. It was a slump. A section of clay wall roughly 4 feet wide sheared off its base and slid inward, burying her to the waist in a cold, heavy embrace of soil. The lantern tipped and went out. The darkness was immediate and total. Britta did not scream. Screaming would have accomplished nothing and wasted air. She reached down and began digging herself out with her bare hands, clawing at the clay that pinned her legs, working by feel in a blackness so complete that she could not tell whether her eyes were open or closed. The clay was dense and wet. It packed under her fingernails and ground against the blisters on her palms. Every handful she removed seemed to be replaced by another handful settling from above. 3 hours. That was how long it took. 3 hours of blind, methodical digging, moving the earth away from her body one fistful at a time, until she could pull her legs free and crawl to the base of the ladder. She climbed into the cabin, relit the lantern with shaking hands, and lay on the floor for a long time, staring at the ceiling and listening to her own breathing. Her hands were bleeding. 3 fingernails were torn. Her back was a single column of pain from the base of her skull to her tailbone. But the fear was not about the pain. The fear was about the recognition. She had been buried in the earth the same way her father had been buried in the earth. And if the slump had been 6 inches deeper or 2 feet wider, she would have died in the same darkness that had taken him. She forced herself to sit up. She lowered the lantern through the opening and looked at the vault below. The slump had occurred at the junction of the new tunnel, where she had been cutting into an area of slightly wetter clay. The main chamber was untouched. The arches that would soon be completed were exactly as they had been designed. Not a crack, not a shift, not a single grain of limestone out of position. The friction lock held under the stress of the slump, absorbing the lateral pressure the way it was designed to do. The way Magnus had designed it to do 40 years before, in a mine on the other side of the Atlantic. Something changed in Britta at that moment. She had been building this vault on the strength of her father's memory, constructing it from lessons she had received as a child and carried through grief and widowhood and 2 years of solitary survival. But now, lying on the floor of her cabin with blood on her hands and the taste of clay in her teeth, she was no longer building from memory. She was building from proof. The arches had been tested by failure, and they had passed. The structure was not theoretical. It was real, and it was hers. Britta had been buried alive, just like her father. But unlike the section that killed Magnus, the arches she built held perfectly. The question now was whether she would have enough time to finish before the deadline, and before something far worse than a deadline arrived. On the night of the 13th day, Zeke came as he had promised. He arrived at 2 in the morning, when the moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds. He carried nothing but the knowledge in his hands and half a bottle of courage in his coat. Odin met him at the edge of the property, recognized his scent, and led him silently to the cabin door. They worked by lantern light in the vault below the cabin floor, fitting the inverted limestone arches that would become the ceiling of the stable and the structural foundation of Britta's home. Zeke's hands remembered the sequence even when his mind wandered. He would test each stone's fit by pressing his palm against its face, feeling for the slight resistance that meant the lock had engaged. When the resistance came, he would nod once and reach for the next piece. They worked upward from the base of each arch, each stone slightly smaller than the one below, until they reached the keystone at the crown. Britta held the keystone in place, while Zeke fitted the final supporting stones on either side. When he stepped back, the arch stood on its own. No mortar, no nails, just geometry and gravity and the fundamental truth that Magnus had taught them both. The more weight placed on top of the arch, the tighter the stones pressed against each other. Snow, furniture, the boots of men walking across the floor. All of it would only compress the structure further. Somewhere around 3 a.m, while they were bracing the final keystone, Zeke spoke again. "Whitaker does not just want your land, Britta." He said it quietly, the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time. He wants the creek, your creek. It is the only water source in this valley that does not freeze solid in winter. The ordinance, the deadline, the livestock, all of it is a wrapper around one thing. He wants the water. Britta stopped moving. She held the stone in her hands and felt its weight shift as the meaning of Zeke's words settled into place. The creek. The spring-fed creek that ran behind her cabin and pooled in a depression near the tree line before continuing south. She had always thought of it as a convenience, a place to wash clothes and water the garden. She had not thought of it as a reason a man like Whitaker would engineer a legal mechanism to destroy her. He has done this before, Zeke continued. 3 families in this valley lost their land the same way. An impossible regulation, a deadline no one can meet. Then Whitaker buys the foreclosed claim for pennies. Your father would have seen it immediately. Magnus always knew when the ground was being cut out from under him. The information changed everything. Britta was not just saving 2 horses and 4 sheep. She was holding a water source that the entire valley depended on, keeping it out of the hands of a man who would use it as leverage against every homestead within 10 miles. Zeke finished the last stone just before dawn. He stood in the vault, his hands black with clay and limestone dust, and looked at the arches above him. They were clean. They were tight. They were perfect. He nodded once, the way Magnus would have nodded, and then he climbed the ladder back into the cabin. At the door, he paused. "I do not know if you will succeed, Britta, but I know Magnus would want you to try." Then he stepped into the fog and was gone. Britta stood alone in her cabin as the first gray light came through the window. She looked down through the open floorboards at the vault below. The arches were complete. The walls were smooth and hard. The space was beginning to look like what it was meant to be, a chamber strong enough to hold 2 horses and 4 sheep, warm enough to sustain them through a blizzard, invisible enough to fool every man, every wolf, and every law that said she could not do what she was doing. The feeling that moved through her was not hope. Hope was what Arvid had lived on, and it had killed him. What she felt was something harder and more useful. It was purpose. On the 14th day, 2 things happened that Britta had not anticipated. The first was a visit from Rowena Stroud. Rowena was 35 years old, married to Leland, and she had once been Britta's closest friend. They had been two young wives together in the early years, sharing meals and firewood, and the quiet companionship of women who understood what it meant to build a life at the edge of the world. Then circumstances had changed. Leland had attached himself to Whitaker. Rowena had retreated into the boundaries of her husband's ambitions. The friendship had not ended so much as it had been set aside, like a book that neither woman had time to read anymore. Rowena arrived in the late afternoon, carrying 2 heavy wool blankets and a wooden crate of flour. She did not come inside. She left the supplies on the porch and stood there for a moment, looking at Britta with an expression that contained equal parts fear and determination. "Winter is coming," Rowena said. "You will need these, whether you are hiding anything or not." Britta looked at the supplies. Good blankets, dense flour, not charity given lightly. These were things Rowena had taken from her own household. Things Leland would notice were missing. "Does Leland know you brought these?" "Leland knows what Leland needs to know." It was the first independent act Rowena had taken since her marriage. Not a rebellion, not a betrayal of her husband. It was a small, quiet assertion that the bargain she had made with survival still left room for the part of her that remembered what it felt like to be alone. Rowena did not ask about the horses. She did not ask about the dirt or the clay or the warm floors. She had drawn her line at the doorway, and she held it now. She would not know. She would not ask, but she would leave blankets and flour on the porch of a woman who had once been her closest friend, and she would ride home and tell Leland nothing because there was nothing to tell. "I do not know what you are building, Britta," Rowena said quietly. "I do not want to know, because if I know, Leland will ask, and I do not know how to lie to my husband." It was a warning and a boundary drawn in the same breath. Rowena was protecting Britta by deliberately refusing to learn the truth. But the chain was visible now. If Whitaker pressured Leland, Leland would pressure Rowena, and Rowena would break. Not because she was weak, but because she had already made her bargain with survival, and that bargain did not include the risk of lying to the man who kept her alive. Britta watched Rowena mount the old mare and ride north, her back straight, her head turned slightly toward the wind, as if listening for something that the air might carry to her. There had been a time when the two of them would have sat at this table until dark, drinking chicory and talking about the small, particular concerns of women who live alone at the edge of the world. That time was gone. It had been taken not by cruelty, but by the quiet machinery of survival. The same machinery that had taken everything else of value in this valley and ground it into something that fit inside a man's ledger. The second thing that happened on the 14th day was that Britta finished the ventilation system. The scent of a horse is a living thing. It rises from the animal in waves, a mixture of sweat, manure, the warm oil in the hide, and the sweet fermentation of half-digested grain. On a cold night, that scent lifts straight up into the still air and spreads outward like smoke from a chimney, reaching distances that the human nose cannot fathom. But a wolf's nose reads with the precision of a compass. A wolf can detect the scent of prey from nearly 2 miles away in the right conditions. A horse standing in an open paddock on a freezing night might as well be lighting a signal fire. This was the problem Britta had been solving since the beginning. A hole in the ground with 2 horses and 4 sheep inside was still a death trap if the scent found its way to the surface. Her father had called the principle the scent trap. He had explained it to her when she was 12, using a model made of damp sand and a candle in the kitchen of their house in Sweden. He had placed the candle inside a small tunnel made of packed sand, lit it, and shown her how the smoke rose straight up and out the top. Then he had sealed the top and run a second tunnel at an angle, connecting it to the fireplace across the room. When the fireplace was burning, the draft pulled the candle smoke horizontally through the second tunnel, and the smoke disappeared into the larger fire. The candle was still burning, but from outside the sand model, you could not see it, smell it, or know it was there. The principle Britta now applied was the same, scaled up to accommodate 6 living animals. She engineered a primary air intake using a buried stone culvert that ran 50 feet from the tree line in a gradual downward slope. Its mouth was hidden beneath a pile of deadfall timber. The culvert pulled fresh air through the earth, where the constant subterranean temperature warmed it before it reached the stable. The animals would breathe cleaned air instead of the raw, freezing atmosphere above ground. The exhaust system was the piece that would determine whether they lived or died. Instead of a vertical chimney that would vent their scent straight into the sky, she constructed a horizontal flue that ran through the subsoil at a slight upward angle, connecting to the back of her cabin's existing hearth. The flue was lined with flat stones and sealed with a mixture of clay and ash that she had hardened with repeated applications of boiling water. When her evening fire was burning, the natural draft of the chimney would pull air through the flue, drawing the warm, scent-laden air from the stable into the fireplace, where the smell of horse sweat and sheep wool and manure would be incinerated by the flames or buried beneath the heavy smell of burning oak and pine. The animals would be invisible to predators because they would essentially be breathing through the cabin's own respiratory system. Air moves from high pressure to low pressure, and scent follows heat. As long as Britta kept a fire burning in the hearth, the draft would pull the stable's atmosphere through the scrubbing flame, and the 6 animals below her floor would vanish from the olfactory map of the valley. She tested the system that evening, burning sage bundles in the vault and checking the chimney output from outside. The smoke that rose from her chimney smelled of sage and oak, nothing more. She tested it again with fresh manure, shoveling droppings into the stable and sealing the floorboards. She walked outside, circled the cabin, and stood downwind for 20 minutes. Odin stood beside her, his nose working the air. Nothing. The system was functional. On the night of the 14th day, she moved the animals. She did not lead them. She baited them with oats, pouring a thin line of grain from the thicket where they had been grazing down into the mouth of the tunnel. Saga went first, the buckskin mare's big head low, nostrils working as she followed the trail of grain into the darkness. Storm followed, pressing his nose against Saga's flank for reassurance. The 4 sheep came next, bunching together, their hooves making soft compressions in the sand. The vault received them the way the earth receives a seed. The temperature stabilized within the hour, holding steady at 55 degrees. The animals did not make distressed sounds. They seemed to sense the weight of the earth around them, the solidity of the stone above their heads, and they settled into the space with a calmness that surprised Britta. Saga began eating from the hay pile in the corner. Storm folded his legs beneath him and lay down on the sand floor. The sheep huddled together near the wall, their wool providing warmth for each other. Britta climbed the ladder and engaged the pulley system she had rigged to lift the final floorboards back into place. The boards settled with a quiet thud, flush with the rest of the floor. She replaced the table and chairs. She swept the area clean of any trace of sand or clay. From the outside, the cabin looked exactly as it had for 2 years. No barn, no fence, no sign of the 6 animals that were the center of her world. The deadline was 12 hours away. Odin lay down beside the spot where the trapdoor was hidden. He could hear the animals below. He could smell them through the cracks in the wood. But he did not bark. He simply rested his graying muzzle on his paws and kept watch. Britta sat in her chair by the hearth and listened. From below, muffled and rhythmic, came the sound of hay being chewed. Steady, unhurried. The sound of animals that did not know they were hidden, that only knew they were warm and fed and safe. She built up the fire in the hearth and watched the draft pull the air through the flue. The chimney smoke drifted into the night sky, carrying nothing but the smell of burning wood. On the morning of October 15th, 1883, Judge Cornelius Whitaker came for his inspection. He brought Leland Stroud and a territorial clerk with an official inspection warrant. They arrived at mid-morning, and Whitaker did not wait for Britta to open the door. He pushed it open himself and walked inside as if the cabin were already his property. Solveig and Gunnar were sitting at the table, eating porridge. They looked up with the wide eyes of children who recognize danger without understanding its shape. Odin rose to his feet, his hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat. "Control your dog, Mrs. Lindqvist," Whitaker said. Britta placed her hand on Odin's head. The growl subsided, but the dog did not lie down. He positioned himself between the children and the judge, his old body tense with protective instinct. This inspection was nothing like the casual visits that had preceded it. Whitaker was methodical and invasive. He opened every cabinet. He looked under the bed. He pulled the curtains from the window and checked the wall behind them. He knocked on the logs with his knuckles, listening for hollow spaces. Leland went around the back of the cabin, pushing through the brush, searching for tracks or hidden structures. Whitaker moved through the room slowly, his boots heavy on the floorboards, and he stopped in the center of the cabin. He was standing directly above the trap door, his weight pressed down on the boards that concealed the iron ring and the leather hinges and the 6 animals standing in the darkness below. Beneath his feet, 8 feet down, the young ewe shifted her weight. It was a small motion, a minor adjustment of hooves in the sand. The sound it made was barely audible, a soft compression of sand against stone, muffled by earth and wood. Britta heard it. Her heart stopped for a full beat, then resumed at twice its normal rate. Whitaker tilted his head. "The floor is unusually warm," he said. "I keep the fire burning all day. Winter is coming." He looked at her. She looked at him. Below them, Saga stood absolutely still, ears upright, listening to the strange, heavy footsteps above her head. The sheep were motionless, pressed together, their breath making small clouds in the underground air. The moment stretched. Whitaker's eyes moved from Britta to the floor and back to Britta. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that something in this cabin did not add up. The warmth of the floor, the quality of the air, which carried a faint richness he could not name. The fact that a widow with no barn and no visible livestock and no apparent means of support looked calm and fed and unbroken when she should have been desperate. But the territorial clerk had already written "compliant" on his form. Leland had found nothing behind the cabin. The warrant did not authorize them to tear up the floorboards of a private residence. Whitaker had suspicion. He did not have evidence. And suspicion without evidence is just weather, something you feel but cannot hold. The clerk, a thin man named Aldrich who had ridden 3 hours from the county seat and wanted nothing more than to ride 3 hours back, closed his ledger and moved toward the door. "The property is in compliance, Judge Whitaker. There are no livestock present and no livestock housing to evaluate. I see no basis for further action." Aldrich spoke with the particular exhaustion of a bureaucrat who has been asked to enforce a regulation he suspects was designed not for public safety, but for private advantage. He had seen Whitaker's name on too many foreclosure documents to believe this was about wolves. Whitaker watched Aldrich leave and did not follow immediately. He stood in the center of Britta's cabin for a long moment, his weight settling into the floorboards, his eyes fixed on the hearth where the modified baffles cast shadows he could not interpret. He was grinding his teeth. It was the only sign of frustration he allowed himself, and it was the most human Britta had ever seen him look. He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back and looked at Britta one final time. "It will be a long winter, Mrs. Lindqvist. I hope you have enough firewood." The door closed. The hoofbeats faded. Britta stood in the center of her cabin and listened until the silence was complete, until there was nothing but the pop of the fire and the muffled living warmth beneath her feet. Solveig looked up from her porridge. "Mama, are the bad men gone?" "Yes, sweetheart, the bad men are gone." Then Britta sat down at the table with her children and ate breakfast as if nothing had happened, as if her entire world was not hidden 8 feet below the floor, as if the next 10 weeks would not determine whether they lived or died. Odin settled back down beside the trapdoor and closed his eyes, but his ears remained upright and his old nose continued working the air. The deadline had passed. The inspection was complete. The livestock had not been found. But the winter was coming, and the winter would be the true test. 3 weeks later, old Zeke appeared at the edge of Britta's property with news that made her blood run cold. He was sober, which was remarkable, and he was frightened, which was terrifying. "Whitaker has been talking in the saloon," Zeke said, standing at her door with his hat in his hands. "He knows something is wrong. He does not know what. But he has told 2 cattlemen that he intends to return with a formal search warrant after the first snow. He believes you are hiding the livestock somewhere, and he will find them." Britta listened, her face still. "He said the word 'somewhere,'" Zeke continued. "That means he has not thought of underground. But he is patient, and patience with a shovel is all you need to uncover a secret buried in clay." The information was worse than Britta had anticipated. She had hoped that the past inspection would end Whitaker's interest. Instead, it had sharpened it. The judge was a man who did not accept defeat, and the fact that he could not explain how a widow with no resources had survived his deadline was eating at him like a splinter beneath the skin. "I need the winter," Britta said quietly. "I need the snow to seal the ground, to make digging impossible." Zeke nodded. "Then you need the storm to come before Whitaker does." Neither of them knew, standing there in the October afternoon, that the storm was already building. That somewhere in the Arctic, a mass of air so cold it would kill exposed flesh in 3 minutes was beginning its slow descent toward Montana. That the winter of 1883 to 84 would become the deadliest in the territory's recorded history. They only knew that time was running out, and that the Earth was the only ally Britta had left. On December 24th, 1883, the sky changed. The blue of early winter was gone, replaced by a low, heavy ceiling of cloud that pressed down on the valley with a physical weight. The barometric pressure dropped so quickly that Britta could feel it in her sinuses, a dull ache behind her eyes that would not go away. The wind stopped entirely. Not a sign of calm, a sign of accumulation. The atmosphere gathering itself before releasing something immense. Old Zeke rode up to the cabin that afternoon, his face gray with knowledge. "I have seen that sky twice in my life," he said. "Both times, people died." He did not stay. He could not help with what was coming. He rode back toward town, and Britta watched him go. knowing that she would not see him again until the world above had been remade. That night, she moved the children into the vault. She told them it was an adventure, a camping trip underground, like the miners used to do in Sweden. Solveig was excited. Gunnar was uncertain but willing. Odin descended the ladder with the careful dignity of an old dog who trusts his owner completely. They settled into the space that Britta had prepared. Blankets and pillows in one corner. A small cook stove vented into the main flue. Enough food and water for 2 weeks. The horses and sheep on the other side of a low stone wall, their body heat contributing to the warmth of the chamber. The temperature underground was 55 degrees. Comfortable, sustainable, safe. Above them, the temperature was about to drop to 40 below zero. The blizzard arrived on Christmas morning. It did not begin dramatically. Snow fell in gentle curtains through the early hours, coating the valley in white. The children woke to a world transformed, and Solveig asked if they could go outside to play. "Not today, sweetheart." By noon, the wind had risen, 40 miles per hour, 50. The snow was no longer falling. It was driving sideways, horizontal sheets of white that reduced visibility to nothing. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 20 below. The wind was screaming at 70 miles per hour. The cabin above groaned and creaked, but the vault below was silent and still. Britta climbed the ladder once to check the fire in the hearth. She added wood, ensured the draft was pulling properly, and descended again. The chimney smoke carried away the scent of 6 animals and 4 humans, dissolving it into the white chaos above. The blizzard did not stop. Day 2, day 3. The snow accumulated at a rate of 8 inches per hour, drifts piled against the cabin walls, 15 feet high. The world above became a featureless white void where direction had no meaning, and survival was measured in minutes. On the 4th night, the wolves came. Britta heard them from the vault, a distant chorus of high, thin cries that penetrated the layers of earth and stone and snow with a frequency that vibrated in the bones rather than the ears. Saga lifted her head from the hay pile and stood rigid, nostrils flared, breath quickening. Storm rose from the sand floor and pressed himself against the far wall, his eyes wide and white-rimmed. But it was the young ewe that frightened Britta most. The animal began to pace back and forth across the width of the vault, her hooves making quick, nervous compressions in the sand, her head tossing, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She could feel the wolves above, not see them, not smell them, but feel them. The way a tuning fork feels the vibration of a piano string in the next room. Some ancient circuit in her blood was firing, telling her that predators were near and that the correct response was to run, and there was nowhere to run. Britta watched the ewe's agitation build. Each pass across the vault was faster than the last. Each toss of her head was more violent. Then she heard it. Faintly, the sound of paws on the frozen surface above. A dry staccato rhythm that moved from north to south directly over the vault. The wolves were crossing her paddock. They were walking on the exact ground beneath which 1,000 pounds of living prey stood trembling. The young ewe opened her mouth to bleat. Britta moved before the sound could form. She crossed the vault in 3 strides and wrapped both arms around the ewe's neck, pulling its head down against her chest. The animal fought her for a moment, its neck muscles bunching and straining, its jaw working against the pressure of her forearms. She held on. She pressed her cheek against the flat plane between its eyes, and she breathed. Slow, deliberate, forcing the rhythm of her lungs into the space between them. The ewe's body shuddered, its legs locked. Above them, the wolves paused. Britta could feel the sensation of stillness through the ceiling, a sudden absence of vibration that was worse than the vibration itself, because it meant the pack had stopped to investigate. She did not breathe. The ewe did not breathe. Solveig sat frozen against the wall, her small hand clamped over Gunnar's mouth. The boy's eyes were huge with fear he did not understand. Odin lay absolutely still, his ears pinned flat against his skull, every muscle in his old body rigid with the instinct to remain invisible. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the vibration resumed, moving south, fading, dissolving into the general white noise of the blizzard above. The wolves had found nothing. The scent trap held. The fire in the hearth above was pulling the stable air through the flue and incinerating every molecule that might have betrayed the presence of 6 animals and 4 humans in the earth below. Britta sank to the sand floor with the ewe's head still in her arms. Her hands were shaking. The animal lowered itself beside her, folding its legs beneath its body, and rested its muzzle on her thigh. She sat there for a long time, feeling its breath slow, feeling her own breath slow, feeling the weight of the earth above them and the cold of the predators that walked upon it. The wolves were standing directly above 6 animals and 4 humans. One sound, one bleat, one bark, one cry from a frightened child, and the pack would start digging. But the scent trap held, the fire kept burning, and the wolves moved on, never knowing what lay 8 feet beneath their paws. The blizzard continued for 8 days. Above ground, the valley was dying. On the 2nd day, the roof of Silas Drummond's main barn collapsed under the weight of the snow. 47 head of cattle died in the wreckage. The ones that survived the collapse froze to death before morning. On the 3rd day, the home of Aldous Pemberton lost its roof to the wind. The engineer from MIT huddled in his root cellar with his wife and 3 children, surrounded by frozen vegetables and the dawning realization that his education had not prepared him for this. On the 4th day, Reverend Holbrook's wife went outside to fetch wood from the pile beside the house. She became disoriented in the whiteout. She froze to death 30 feet from her own door. Her husband found her body when the storm finally broke, curled in the snow with her arms wrapped around a single piece of firewood. On the 5th day, Jasper Kettridge lost 3 fingers to frostbite trying to rescue his father's horses from a collapsing stable. The horses died anyway. On the 6th day, Prudence Whitley's general store lost its front wall. The inventory she had spent 20 years accumulating was buried under 8 feet of snow and debris. On the 7th day, Leland and Rowena Stroud huddled in their cabin, watching their last fire die. Their entire flock of sheep had frozen in the first 3 days. Their food stores were running low. The walls were thick with frost on the inside, and the cold was seeping through every crack and joint. And through it all, in a vault beneath a widow's cabin, the temperature held at 55 degrees. Britta fed her horses and sheep. She read stories to her children by lantern light. She kept the fire burning in the hearth above, climbing the ladder twice a day to add wood and check the draft. The scent trap continued to function. The wolves continued to pass overhead without stopping. The children grew accustomed to the underground life. Solveig made up games involving the animals. Gunnar learned to count by counting sheep. Odin moved between them all, his old presence a comfort that required no explanation. On the morning of the 8th day, the blizzard stopped. Britta climbed the ladder and pushed open the trapdoor. The cabin above was intact, but transformed. Frost covered every surface. The windows were opaque with ice. The door was blocked by a drift that reached to the top of the frame. She dug her way out through a window, emerging into a world she did not recognize. The paddock fence had vanished beneath 4 feet of snow. The tree line was a row of white pillars. The road to town no longer existed. In its place was an unbroken field that stretched from her cabin to the base of the eastern ridge without a single mark upon it. No tracks, no wheel ruts, no footprints. Just the snow and the blue shadow it cast in the morning light, and the terrible, beautiful silence of a landscape that had erased every trace of human intention. Then she heard the shouting. It came from the north, faint at first, broken into syllables by the distance and the density of the cold air. She shaded her eyes and saw 3 figures laboring through the drifts, moving in a line. The first one breaking trail, the other 2 following in the trench he carved behind him. She recognized Silas Drummond before she recognized the others. He was in front, his hat gone, his coat blackened with frost, moving with the dogged mechanical stride of a man who has been walking for hours and has passed through exhaustion into the numb territory beyond it. Behind him came Aldous Pemberton, the engineer, supporting his youngest son. Behind them came Reverend Holbrook, alone, his face a mask of grief that would never fully heal. They reached the porch, and Silas hit the door with the flat of his palm, not knocking, striking. The sound of a man who had lost the energy for courtesy and retained only the animal need for warmth. Britta opened the door. The interior warmth met the exterior cold at the threshold, and the collision produced a visible cloud of condensation that hung in the doorway for a moment before the draft pulled it inside. Silas crossed the threshold and stopped 2 steps into the room. His chest was heaving. His eyes moved across the cabin with the frantic inventory of a man looking for something he cannot name. He saw the fire in the hearth, modest, well-maintained, the fire of a person who understands that efficiency outlasts extravagance. He saw the clean floor, the orderly shelves, the table set against the wall with cups and plates, as if the occupants had eaten breakfast that morning without urgency. He saw a woman who was thinner than she had been 2 months ago, but who stood with her weight balanced and her hands still and her eyes clear. He had expected ruin. He had expected a cabin as devastated as his own ranch, a woman as broken as his own livestock count. What he found instead was order, and the order enraged him because he could not explain it. "How?" he said. The word was not a question. It was a demand. Pemberton entered behind Silas, then Reverend Holbrook, then others, arriving in 1s and 2s over the next hour. Jasper Kettridge with his bandaged hand. Leland and Rowena Stroud leaning on each other for support. Prudence Whitley, silent for the first time anyone could remember. And through all of it, Britta said nothing. She welcomed them into her cabin. She gave them warm water and what food she could spare. She let them sit by her fire and feel their frozen extremities begin to burn with returning circulation. But she did not explain. Not yet. It was Pemberton who noticed first. He knelt in the center of the room and pressed his palm flat against the floor, his fingers spread wide. He held that position for several seconds. The floor was warm, but that was not what stopped him. There was movement below, not vibration exactly, something deeper, a rhythmic displacement of air that transmitted through the packed earth and the wooden joists and into the pine boards as a pulse. Slow, regular, unmistakably biological. "The ground is breathing," he said. He did not say it loudly. He said it the way a man speaks when he has encountered evidence that contradicts everything he has assumed to be true, and the weight of the contradiction has compressed his voice into something barely above a whisper. Silas turned from the hearth. He had been examining the chimney, noticing the stone baffles at the back that he could not account for. the modification to the flue that had no corresponding feature in any cabin he had ever built or inspected. He looked at Pemberton on the floor. He looked at Britta standing by the table. The arithmetic was assembling itself behind his eyes, each variable clicking into place with the precision of a lock mechanism turning. "Where are they, Mrs. Lindqvist?" Britta met his gaze. She walked to the center of the room. She knelt where Pemberton had knelt. Her hand found the iron ring that was set flush with the boards, invisible unless you knew where to look, and pressed with exactly the right angle. She gripped it and pulled. The counterweight system engaged with a deep, groaning tension. A 6-foot section of the floor pivoted upward on its leather hinges and locked in the open position. The air that rose from the opening was warm and dense and alive. It carried the smell of hay and grain and animal sweat and the particular, unmistakable sweetness of livestock that had been well fed and dry and calm for weeks. The smell filled the cabin in seconds, displacing the thin, sharp air of the winter morning with something ancient and mammalian and profoundly reassuring. Jasper Kettridge made a sound in his throat that was not a word. Pemberton rose to his feet and stepped to the edge of the opening and looked down. Silas Drummond did not move for several seconds, and when he did, it was not toward the opening, but away from it. One step backward, as if the hole in the floor had revealed not a stable, but a fissure in the logic of his world. Below them, in the amber light of the lantern that Britta had left burning on its stone pillar, 2 horses and 4 sheep stood on clean sand in a vaulted chamber of smooth clay walls and a ceiling of interlocking stone arches. Saga was at the hay pile, chewing. Storm was standing with his head turned toward the opening above, his ears forward, his expression alert but untroubled. The sheep huddled together near the wall, their wool thick and healthy, and off to one side, sitting on a blanket with a book in her lap, was Solveig. Gunnar sat beside her, counting sheep under his breath. Odin lay across their feet, his tail wagging slowly at the faces appearing above. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Then Pemberton descended the ladder. He moved with the slow, careful steps of a man entering a space he does not fully trust. When his boots touched the sand floor, he stood still for a long time, turning in a slow circle, taking in the dimensions and the construction and the quality of the air. He touched the walls. He looked up at the arches. He found the mouth of the ventilation flue and held his hand in front of it, feeling the steady, warm current of air that moved through it. He followed the flue with his eyes to the point where it entered the back of the hearth above, and he understood, in a single moment of clarity, the entire system. The earth warmed the intake air. The animals warmed the vault. The fire drew the exhaust. The chimney scrubbed the scent. The cabin and the stable were not 2 structures. They were one organism. He climbed back up and faced Silas Drummond. The words he spoke were not dramatic. They were technical, and they were the most devastating thing Silas had ever heard. "It is not a hole in the dirt, Drummond. It is a mine. She built a mine for the living. 23 people survived the worst blizzard in Montana history inside a chamber built by a widow with no money, no crew, and no formal education. Only the knowledge her father had given her in a copper mine 6,000 miles away. They stayed in the vault for 3 more days while the temperature outside slowly climbed from 40 below to merely brutal. 23 people. The Drummond family, the Pembertons, Reverend Holbrook, the Kettridges, the Strouds, the Whitleys, others who arrived during those first desperate hours, drawn by the smoke from Britta's chimney, which was the only smoke rising in a valley of collapsed structures and dead fires. They slept on the sand floor in shifts. They ate from Britta's stores, which she had calculated for 4 people and 6 animals, not 31. But somehow the food stretched. Somehow the warmth held. Somehow the chamber that should have been cramped with that many bodies felt instead like a sanctuary. The stone arches above them a reminder that the earth itself was holding them safe. On the second night, Britta explained the system to everyone. She stood in the center of the vault, surrounded by faces that had called her foolish and dangerous and mad, and she taught them what her father had taught her. The earth at 8 feet maintains 55 degrees, regardless of what happens above. The arches distribute weight outward. The more snow on top, the stronger the structure becomes. The ventilation pulls animal scent through the fireplace. Wolves cannot smell what the flames have burned. Pemberton listened with the particular intensity of a man whose entire professional framework was being reconstructed in real time. "The friction lock," he said. "The stones are held in place by geometry, not mortar. The harder you push down, the tighter they grip." "Yes." "And the thermal mass of the clay. The walls themselves store heat." "Yes." "This is..." Pemberton paused, searching for the right word. "This is not primitive. This is not folk engineering. This is applied physics. Your father understood principles that my professors at MIT never mentioned." "My father understood the earth," Britta said simply. "He listened to it. He worked with it. He did not try to fight it." In one corner, Temperance Yardley sat with a leather journal balanced on her knees. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a merchant, and she had been asking questions since the moment she descended the ladder. How deep was the chamber? What was the angle of the ventilation flue? How had Britta calculated the arch loads without formal training? Britta answered each question patiently. Here, finally, was someone who wanted to understand rather than simply survive. Someone who saw the vault not just as a refuge, but as a lesson. "Write it all down," Britta told her. "Someday you will teach it to someone else." Temperance wrote until her hand cramped, then switched hands and kept writing. 20 years later, she would publish the first formal documentation of the Lindqvist cellar technique, based on the notes she took during those 3 days underground. On the third day, when the survivors finally emerged into the blinding white landscape, they found a valley transformed. The statistics would be calculated later. 73 people dead across 4 counties. 89% of all barns and livestock structures collapsed. Over 4,000 head of cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs lost. Economic damage estimated at $2.3 million in 1883 terms. The Lindqvist vault had lost nothing. Judge Cornelius Whitaker was not among the survivors in Britta's cabin. He had ridden out the storm in the root cellar of the county courthouse, surrounded by legal documents and frozen preserves. His ranch had been devastated. 340 head of cattle dead. 2 barns collapsed. His foreman and 2 ranch hands frozen in the wreckage of a bunkhouse that had been built to territorial specifications. He did not come to Britta's cabin to be saved. He did not come to apologize. He did not come at all. When the roads were finally passable, he loaded his remaining possessions onto a wagon and drove south without speaking to anyone. He sold his holdings that spring to a consortium from Denver and never returned to Madison County. No one in Granite Falls ever saw him again. But there were others who did come. Others who stood in the wreckage of their own preparations and acknowledged what they had failed to see. Silas Drummond was the first. He stood in Britta's yard on the morning after the survivors departed, his hat in his hands, his face aged 10 years by what he had witnessed. "I called you a fool, Mrs. Lindqvist," he said. "I told everyone you were digging your children's grave. I was wrong. You were building the only thing in this valley that could save us, and you let us in anyway." Britta looked at him for a long moment. "You are welcome to learn, Mr. Drummond. Knowledge is not something I intend to hoard." Silas nodded slowly. "I would like that. I would like my sons to learn as well, so this never happens to my family again." Pemberton came next. The engineer stood in the vault, running his hands over the arches, making notes in a leather journal. "I have a degree from MIT, he said. "I told you the soil could not support arch loads. Your father, who never saw the inside of a university, understood something I did not. The earth wants to hold together. You just have to listen to it." He paused, looking at the friction lock stones. "I would like to document this structure. With your permission. I believe it could be of significant value to the engineering community." "Document whatever you wish," Britta said, "but teach it as well. Knowledge in a journal helps no one. Knowledge in the hands of builders saves lives." Reverend Holbrook came last. He stood at the entrance to the vault, unable to bring himself to descend the ladder. His wife was buried in the frozen ground behind his church, waiting for spring when the earth would be soft enough to receive her properly. "I called your methods pagan," he said. His voice was hollow, emptied by grief. "My wife died in a house built the Christian way. Your father's knowledge, whatever its origin, kept 23 souls alive. Perhaps God speaks through many teachers." He did not ask for forgiveness. Britta did not offer it. Some wounds are too fresh for absolution, and some lessons are too expensive to be learned gracefully. But he left her doorway with something he had not possessed when he arrived: the beginning of humility, the first crack in a certainty that had cost him everything. Jasper Kettridge came on a day when the spring thaw was just beginning to show at the edges of the snowpack. He stood at Britta's door with his bandaged hand held awkwardly at his side. 3 fingers would never bend again. 3 fingers that had frozen while he tried to save animals that died anyway, using methods that everyone had assured him were correct. "I bet $5 your shelter would collapse," he said. "I was going to dig graves to mock you." He looked at the ground, at his ruined hand, at the woman who had built something that defied everything he thought he knew. "Mrs. Lindqvist, I would like to learn how to build what you built, if you would teach me." Britta looked at this young man who had been so confident in his cruelty, so certain that he understood the way the world worked. He was 22 years old, and he had learned something in the blizzard that would shape the rest of his life. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Bring a shovel. Be ready to listen." Jasper Kettridge would become Britta's first formal student. He would work beside her through the summer of 1884, learning the principles of friction lock and thermal mass and earth-integrated construction. He would build his own Lindqvist cellar on his father's property that fall, and he would never again mock something he did not understand. 20 years later, he would teach the technique to his own sons, and his sons would teach their sons, and the knowledge that began in a Swedish copper mine would spread through 3 generations of Montana builders. But that was in the future. In the spring of 1884, there was only the work. The slow, patient work of rebuilding a valley that had been humbled by winter. Britta taught anyone who wanted to learn. She charged no fee for the instruction, though she accepted payment in labor when it was offered. She showed them how to read soil composition, how to calculate arch loads, how to design ventilation systems that would scrub scent and circulate fresh air. She taught them the principle her father had taught her in a copper mine on the other side of the world. The earth wants to hold together. Your job is not to fight it. Your job is to listen to it and to build in ways that honor what it already knows how to do. By the fall of 1884, 11 families had begun construction on what the community called Lindqvist Cellars. By the winter of 1885, 23 such structures existed in Madison County. By 1890, the technique had spread to neighboring counties, and the number had grown to over 100. Not a single person who sheltered in a Lindqvist cellar died in the winters that followed. Rowena Stroud left her husband in the spring of 1884. It was not a dramatic departure. There was no confrontation, no accusation, no public scandal. She simply packed her belongings one morning and walked to Britta's cabin and asked if she could stay for a while. Leland did not come after her. He had been broken by the blizzard in ways that went beyond the loss of his livestock. He had spent years attaching himself to powerful men, believing that proximity to power would keep him safe. The storm had shown him that power meant nothing when the temperature dropped far enough. He sold his land that summer and moved to California. Rowena never heard from him again. She lived with Britta for 2 years, helping with the children, helping with the teaching, helping to rebuild the friendship that had been set aside when their circumstances diverged. Eventually, she remarried, a widower from Helena who appreciated both her strength and her history. But she never forgot those days in the vault, the warmth of the earth, the smell of hay and animal and survival, the sight of her former best friend standing in the center of the chaos, calm and capable and vindicated. "You saved us," she told Britta on the day she left for her new life. "Not just our bodies. You saved something else, something I cannot name." "Your father saved me," Britta replied. 25 years ago in a tunnel in Pennsylvania. I was only passing it forward. Old Zeke Thorne stopped drinking the night he helped build the arches. Nobody knew exactly what changed in him, what mechanism engaged to reverse the long, slow collapse of a man who had been falling for 20 years. Some said it was the work itself, the feeling of his hands remembering a skill he thought he had lost. Some said it was the completion of a debt that had hung over him since 1858, when Magnus Lindqvist carried him out of a collapsing tunnel and asked nothing in return. Whatever the reason, Zeke emerged from that night as a different man. He paid off his debt to the various merchants who had extended him credit over the years. He took a job with the county road crew, working through the summers, building bridges that did not collapse. He moved into a better cabin on the south side of town and kept it clean. He lived for another 12 years, and he never touched a bottle in all that time. When he died in the summer of 1895, they buried him in the town cemetery with a simple stone marker, just his name and his dates. He had not wanted to be remembered for what he had been, only for how he had ended. Britta attended the funeral. She stood at the edge of the grave and remembered a night in her vault when an old man's trembling hands had placed stones with a precision that contradicted everything his body had become. "He helped me build something that saved 23 lives," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "That is his legacy. The rest does not matter." Odin died in the winter of 1887. He was 13 years old, which was ancient for a border collie. He had been slowing down for months, his joints stiff, his eyes cloudy, his legendary energy finally beginning to fade. But he never stopped following Britta, never stopped positioning himself between her and any stranger who approached, never stopped sleeping at the foot of the children's bed, guardian and companion and living connection to the man who had raised him. He died in his sleep, curled in his usual spot beside the kitchen hearth. Britta found him in the morning, already cold, his muzzle resting on his paws, as if he had simply decided to close his eyes and not open them again. They buried him beneath the apple tree behind the cabin, in a spot where the morning sun would warm the earth above him. Solveig made a wooden cross and painted his name on it. Gunnar cried for 3 days. Britta did not cry. She had learned to ration grief, and she had work to do. But she carved a small inscription on a flat stone and placed it at the head of his grave. He guarded the door. He never left her side. It was the truest thing she could say about any of them, really. About Odin, about Magnus, about Arvid despite his flaws, about everyone who had ever loved her and stayed until they could not stay any longer. Loyalty outlasts almost everything, even death. The Lindqvist cellar became a regional standard. In 1890, the Territorial Council officially recognized the design as a compliant alternative to traditional livestock housing. The vote was unanimous, which would have been unthinkable 7 years earlier. But 7 years of evidence had accumulated. 7 years of blizzards survived, and livestock preserved, and lives saved. The council member who proposed the resolution was a man named Thomas Whitmore. He had lost his first wife in the blizzard of 1883 and had spent the years since studying the engineering principles that had allowed Britta Lindqvist's animals to survive when his own had perished. "This design is not primitive," Whitmore said in his speech to the council. "It is not folk superstition. It is applied physics, developed through generations of practical experience in the mines of Northern Europe. Our territorial building codes should reflect what works, not what we assume should work." The resolution passed without opposition. Britta was invited to attend the council meeting, but she declined. She had teaching to do, she said. Students to instruct, knowledge to transmit. She was not interested in recognition. She was interested in results. In 1967, researchers from Montana State University conducted a formal study of 3 Lindqvist cellars that were still standing and in use. The structures had been maintained by successive generations of the families that built them. The arches had not shifted. The walls had not cracked. The ventilation systems still functioned as designed. The researchers measured the thermal performance and found that the cellars maintained temperatures between 52 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, regardless of exterior conditions. They calculated that the structures were 2.7 times more energy efficient than conventional livestock housing of similar capacity. They published their findings in a journal of agricultural engineering, with a note observing that the principles demonstrated in the Lindqvist cellars were identical to those employed in modern passive house design and in the construction of research stations in extreme environments, including the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. The knowledge that had traveled from Swedish copper mines to Montana homesteads had been rediscovered by the institutions that had once dismissed it as impossible. Britta Lindqvist did not live to see that validation, but she would not have been surprised by it. She had never doubted that her father was right. She had only waited for the world to catch up. She lived in that cabin for another 45 years. She raised her children there, watched them grow, watched them leave and return and leave again, as children do. Solveig became a teacher in Bozeman, where she incorporated practical engineering principles into her curriculum. Gunnar became a structural engineer, designing underground shelters for communities throughout the northern states. Britta never remarried. She had loved Arvid despite his flaws, and she had no interest in replacing him with someone new. The cabin was enough. The work was enough. The children and grandchildren who filled her table on holidays were enough. She died in the winter of 1928, at the age of 79. She had been failing for months, her body finally surrendering to the accumulation of decades. But she had insisted on remaining in the cabin, in the place she had defended against wolves and blizzards and powerful men, in the place where she had built something that outlasted all of them. On her last night, she asked Gunnar to carry her down the ladder into the vault. He was 50 years old by then, a grandfather himself, but he lifted her as gently as if she were a child. He laid her on a blanket in the space that had once held horses and sheep and 23 terrified survivors. She looked up at the arches her father had designed and her hands had built. "The stones have not moved," she whispered. 45 years, and they have not moved." "No, Mama, they have not moved." She was silent for a long time. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the ceiling, gradually closed. "Listen to the earth," Shashi said, so quietly that Gunnar had to lean close to hear. "It tells you everything you need to know." She died just before dawn, with the warmth of the earth around her and the smell of clay in the air. They buried her beside Arvid in the cemetery on the hill above town. Her stone was simple, as she had requested, just her name and her dates and a single line of text. She listened to the earth. The cabin stood for another 34 years. In 1962, the county decided to widen the road that ran past the Lindqvist property. The cabin was in the way. The decision was made to demolish it. The demolition crew arrived on a Tuesday morning in August. They were practical men, accustomed to tearing down old structures to make way for new ones. They did not expect to find anything unusual. When they pulled up the floorboards, they discovered the vault. The arches had not moved. The walls were smooth and solid. The sand floor was dry. The air inside was cool and still, carrying a faint mineral smell that the foreman said reminded him of a root cellar, though he had never been in a root cellar that felt so deliberately constructed, so intentionally permanent. He stood in the vault for a long time, running his hand along the friction-lock stones that had been placed there 80 years earlier. He wrote in his report that the subterranean chamber appeared to be of significant historical and engineering interest. He recommended that the site be preserved. Today, a bronze plaque marks the spot where the cabin stood. It is mounted on a stone cairn at the edge of the road, facing west toward the ridge where the wolves once gathered before descending into the valley. The plaque does not mention Britta's widowhood. It does not mention Arvid or Magnus or the 15-day deadline or the man who tried to take her land. It does not tell the story of a woman who dug a secret beneath her own floor and hid 6 animals from the sharpest noses in the natural world. Instead, it lists the dimensions of the vault. It records the calculated thermal efficiency of the airflow system. It notes the date of construction and the date of discovery, and the number of years the structure survived without maintenance or repair. It presents the work not as a story of defiance, but as a statement of method. A record of what happens when a human being stops arguing with the earth and starts listening to it. The horses are gone. The sheep are gone. The wolves are gone. The cabin is gone. The creek still runs, though its banks have been regraded and its course has been adjusted to accommodate the road. But beneath the surface, beneath the asphalt and the gravel and the compacted fill that the county engineers laid down when they built the road, the stones of the Lindqvist vault remain, locked in their arches, held in place by the same force that locked them there in October of 1883. Gravity has not changed. The geometry has not shifted. The earth is still holding. And if you drive that road on a winter night, when the snow is falling and the wind is pushing against your windshield, and the headlights carve a narrow tunnel of light through the darkness, You will pass over that spot without knowing it. You will pass over the place where a woman looked at the ground and saw not an obstacle, but an answer. Where she dug into the earth with hands that bled and a mind that calculated and a will that did not bend. Where she built something so aligned with the fundamental laws of the physical world that it has outlasted every human structure erected above it. You will not see the plaque in the darkness. You will not feel the stones beneath your tires, but they are there. They have always been there. And they will be there long after the road is gone and the plaque has weathered to nothing, and the last person who remembers the name Lindqvist has drawn their final breath. The vault does not need to be remembered. It only needs to remain. And that is where our story ends. But perhaps, in another sense, it is where it begins. Because the knowledge that Britta Lindqvist preserved did not die with her. It spread through families and communities and generations, through students and builders and engineers who listened when she taught and remembered when she was gone. Somewhere tonight, in a basement built on principles first developed in the copper mines of Sweden, a family is warm while the wind howls outside. Somewhere tonight, an old farmer is telling his grandchildren about the woman who taught his father how to build, and his father's father before that. Somewhere tonight, the earth is holding, as it always has, as it always will. All you have to do is listen. The end.